My name's Andrew Prescott, for those of you who don't know me, and it's a great honour for me to introduce tonight's speaker of the Open Lectures on Freemasonry, Professor Aubrey Newman. It's particularly appropriate for me to be introducing Aubrey because he's one of the many distinguished historians to have been trained at my home institution, the University of Glasgow. Aubrey quickly established himself as one of the talented generation of historians of the 18th century in Parliament, inspired by the work of Lewis Namier, and after a scholarship at the University of Oxford and a spell at Bedford College, University of London, another institution which we share, Aubrey was appointed to work on one of the great British historical enterprises, the History of Parliament, a biographical dictionary of members of both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. In 1959, Aubrey was appointed to a lectureship at the University of Lecturer, where he became one of the most distinguished members of the university, being appointed as professor there, and even being entrusted with the writing of the modern history of the university, which, as you can imagine, is a very delicate task. Through his work on 18th century British political history, Aubrey connects us to a great tradition in British historiography associated with names such as Dame Lucy Sutherland, and Aubrey has made many distinguished contributions to this field. But Aubrey's interests as a historian are very wide-ranging. He's one of the leading authorities on British Jewish history. He's a past president of the Jewish Historical Society of England, and in 1990, he founded what is now the Stanley Burton Centre for Holocaust Studies at Leicester, the oldest Holocaust research centre in a British university, of which he remains Honorary Associate Director. And the annual Aubrey Newman Lecture was instituted at the centre in 2006. And Aubrey, of course, has been an energetic and indefatigable historian of Freemasonry. I would go as far as to say that he's been the leading British exponent since the Second World War of the proposition that the study of the history of Freemasonry should reflect professional historical concerns and methods. Aubrey was made a Mason in December 1967 in John of Gaunt Lodge number 523 in Leicester. He served as master of his mother lodge, and has also served as master of the Lodge of Research number 2429 in Leicester, and of the very famous Quattro Coronati Lodge number 2076. He's a past provincial junior Grand Warden, as well as a past provincial Grand Scribe N of Leicestershire and Rutland. And he's also a past junior Grand Deacon of the United Grand Lodge of England. Aubrey's contributions to Masonic history have covered such diverse matters as the history of the provinces and Jews in English Freemasonry. He was Prestonian lecturer in 2003 and for over 10 years has chaired the editorial committee of Quattro Coronati Lodge. He was the joint organiser of the highly successful Tercentenary Conference at Cambridge in 2016. Aubrey is now in his 90s, but he shows not the least sign of slowing up at all. Indeed, he's still teaching regularly, which I think is an amazing achievement, and his research seems to have gained pace and impetus. As a Freemason from Leicester in the Midlands, one of Aubrey's greatest themes has been stressing for us the importance of the provinces in thinking about the history of English Freemasonry, and it's the provincial Grand Master who's his subject for us tonight. So I think Aubrey's going to speak to something that is really quite central for thinking about the way in which English Freemasonry works. Before I hand over to Aubrey, can I encourage you to use the chat facility in the Zoom webinar to forward any questions that you might have, and we will pose these to Aubrey after his lecture. But let me first now hand over to Aubrey and welcome him very much to the Open Lectures on Freemasonry. Aubrey.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I have over many years been very interested in the part played by the province in the growth and development of English Freemasonry. Not just because I am a provincial Freemason, because I'm convinced it has only been through the part played by the province in the structure of English Freemasonry that English Freemasonry has been able to grow so strongly from small beginnings in the early 18th century to where it is today. And it's very significant that although other Grand Lodges have an element of what we might call devolution in their structures, none of them, not even Scotland or Ireland, has come near to a close parallel with the English structure. The lodges forming the first Grand Lodge were all from the cities of London and Westminster. That's not to say there were no lodges elsewhere, but merely that they were not included in that original group. As a little later on, in 1723, we have the earliest known list of regular constituted lodges, still containing only London lodges. But in 1725, the second of such lists includes named lodges not only in London, but such places as Bath, Bristol, Norwich, Chichester, and Chester. By 1729, the minutes of Grand Lodge record various groups of Masons outside London petitioning Grand Lodge for deputations, so they might be constituted as regular lodges, paying due obedience to the Grand Master and his officers, and making regular contributions to the Grand Charity. The Master of one London Lodge, for example, informs Grand Lodge that several good Masons meet at Scarborough in Yorkshire in the summer season, and were desirous to meet as Masons. Or there's a lodge in Manchester, which presented a petition to Grand Lodge, praying that the list of their members may be entered in the Grand Lodge book, and that they may be under the care and patronage of the Grand Lodge. There was also a very significant new development, the appearance of a provincial Grand Master. And there are two letters in the papers of one of the early Grand Masters, the second Duke of Richmond, dated 1725, which throw considerable light upon this. In one of them, the new provincial Grand Master in Chester wrote to the Duke, "The brotherhood being greatly increased, it was thought advisable for the preservation of good order and the greater expediency of meeting, to form them into two lodges, to which we have since submitted a third, and each of them to make choice and have their own proposed master and wardens. These have come to the following resolution, with all due respect and submission to your grace as the General Grand Master, that it was proper and highly necessary for the good of all, because of the great distance, that some person of note from among the brethren should be annually chosen to preside over all by the style and title of Provincial Grand Master." And further light comes from the second letter. "Upon our dividing into 3 lodges, which we thought convenient, because several of our brethren who are poor artificers, but being old at the lodges, to be intended that the harmony and unanimity might be kept up amongst us, and that we might all be under the same regulation." In 1727, the minutes of Grand Lodge register the existence of provincial Grand Masters in Cheshire and South Wales, and with the growth in the number of lodges in the provinces and overseas, the number of such deputations by the Grand Master had also increased. Deputations had by then been requested by and sent to 4 counties in England, and there's a record of 16 ad hoc appointments of provincial Grand Masters at various dates. They cover areas in Central Europe, especially Hamburg and Hanover, East India, quote, "where nobody is to be found," unquote, and Africa and North America. And a later edition of the Book of Constitutions was to explain that the office of Provincial Grand Master was found particularly necessary in 1726, when the extraordinary increase of the craftsmen and their travelling into distant parts and convening themselves in lodges required an immediate head, to whom they might apply in all cases, where it was not possible to wait the decision of the Grand Lodge. Clearly, provincial Grand Masters represented the Grand Master in places considered too far distant from London for Grand Lodge to be able to exert any effective authority. And sometimes they were appointed without there being any definite plan about their powers. They might well be, quote, invested with the power of a Grand Master in his particular district, and also empowered to appoint Grand Officers for his province. But there was no provision for a provincial Grand Lodge, and any such officers had status only while they officiated in their particular district. There are also instances of the appointment of individuals as provincial Grand Master to areas where there were no lodges for them to supervise, such as on several occasions to the English province of Rutland. And that raises the question as to why such appointments were ever made. It might have been just to give leading Freemasons in London special status at meetings of Grand Lodge. In some provinces, brethren were concerned that London had been too slow in filling up vacancies as provincial Grand Master, while in others, the local gentry were concerned that their provincial Grand Master was not performing his duties adequately. What were the geographic boundaries of these provinces? We must turn now to an important aspect of English 18th century society. Over the ages, the medieval shire in England had become an important administrative and social centre, so that by the 18th century, the county represented a lively community, socially, politically, and administratively. The country gentry organised the election of the members of Parliament representing the county. The country gentry served as justices of the peace, delivering justice for the county. And the country gentry who served on the bench also supervised the general administration as well as the roads and bridges of the county. It's not surprising, therefore, that the county should become the centre of Masonic life as well, and the early provincial Grand Masters were appointed for these clearly defined areas. But when, for example, the number of lodges in Lancashire had become too much for a single provincial Grand Master, so that it had to be divided between East and West Lancashire, there developed a considerable confusion as to their respective boundaries. The provincial Grand Secretary for West Lancashire wrote to the Grand Secretary in London, "The Right Worshipful, the provincial Grand Master, also instructs me to solicit from the Grand Lodge a definition of the boundary between East and West Lancashire. A number of brethren at Chorley in Lancashire, having it in contemplation to petition the Most Worshipful Grand Master to grant them a warrant to hold a new lodge in that town, none being held there at present, neither they nor the provincial Grand Master are certain whether Chorley or part of Chorley is in the eastern or the western division of Lancashire. A plan of the province would be most useful for cross-reference." The first official mention of the existence of provincial Grand Masters in Anderson's Book of Constitutions comes in the 1738 edition. Anderson mentions the various deputations that have been issued both for home and for abroad, making it quite clear that these foreign lodges are under the patronage of our Grand Master of England. He goes on to comment that the old lodge at York City and the lodges of Scotland, Ireland, France, and Italy, affecting independency, are under their own Grand Masters. This lodge at York is of particular interest to us. There is a record of a lodge working in York in 1705, holding a general lodge there once or twice a year, but granting licenses for occasional meetings elsewhere in Yorkshire. At those general meetings in York, a local notable was usually elected as president. But in 1725, instead of electing a president, the brethren elected a Grand Master, a deputy, wardens, treasurer and clerk, and declared themselves the Grand Lodge of all England held at York. It was clearly placing itself in opposition to the body meeting in London. It was dormant from 1740 until 1761, and after that managed to exist until 1792, when it finally disappeared. In the meantime, there had been in London a split in one of the main lodges, a split led by William Preston, who changed his allegiance from London to the Grand Lodge of York, and for some time claimed that his group of Masons had been constituted the Grand Lodge of all England south of the River Trent. The dispute between Preston and London was settled in 1789, when this new Grand Lodge disappears. And 3 years later, the York Grand Lodge also disappeared. None of these Grand Lodges created provincial Grand Masters. And when in 1751 in London, a rival Grand Lodge of the Ancients was set up, it made no attempt to create a regular structure of provincial Grand Masters in England. They appointed one provincial Grand Master, broadly covering several counties in the north, but he did not hold office for long. And it's likely that this difference between the Grand Lodge, the modern Grand Lodge and the ancients Grand Lodge, reflects the different social basis of the moderns and the ancients. Where the lodges of the moderns had substantial gentry support, those of the ancients seem more often to have been based on the rising commercial classes. There is, however, a very different pattern overseas, particularly in the American colonies, including the West Indies, where there was considerable pressure for the creation of a number of provincial Grand Masters. As a result, the Moderns Grand Lodge appointed a total of 21 individuals as provincial Grand Masters of various areas in the colonies. Sometimes they were appointed with narrowly defined areas, and sometimes of and for America. But the ancients appointed 7 provincial Grand Masters in the American colonies, and even the Grand Lodge of Scotland appointed 3. The patent of one of them was originally for Boston and 100 miles thereabout, but was afterwards broadened out to cover what was described as North America. As I said, the existence of provincial Grand Masters had been first recognized in the 1738 Book of Constitutions, and a later edition contained 4 articles under the heading of Provincial Grand Masters. Article 1 on the origins of the office has already been referred to by me. Article 2 explained that his appointment was by the Grand Master as he thinks fit, during pleasure. Article 3 invested the Provincial Grand Master with the power of a Deputy Grand Master. And Article 4 ordered him to transmit an account of his proceedings to Grand Lodge at least once every year, together with a list of the lodges he had constituted and their contributions to the charity. There is no mention of any provincial Grand Lodge. In the edition of the Book of Constitutions, published in 1767, he is empowered to create various officers such as wardens, treasurer, secretary. In the 1784 edition of the Book of Constitutions, specific officers are not named. Among 18th century provincial Grand Masters, probably the most significant was Thomas Dunkerley. Between 1767 and 1795, he was the provincial Grand Master of 8 provinces and presided over 2 others. It was he who introduced regular annual meetings of his various provincial Grand Lodges. He insisted on regularly inspecting individual lodges and tried to ensure that all correspondence between London and individual lodges in his province went through him. He did not always get his own way, but he was particularly anxious to promote the social significance of provincial Grand Lodges amongst the local gentry. This, he says, will enable me to appoint a greater number of blue and red aprons, which I find of great advantage to the society, as it attracts the notice of the principal gentlemen in the several counties, who seem ambitious to attend me at my provincial Grand Lodge. Significantly, one of his achievements was the promotion of a flow of donations from the provinces to London in support of the attempts to build a Masonic hall as headquarters for the modern Grand Lodge, as well as maintaining the Grand Charity. From 1815 onwards, the Book of Constitutions required the provincial Grand Master to hold a provincial Grand Lodge meeting at least once a year. But during the 1850s, when there were serious splits in Grand Lodge between the dais, the Masonic establishment, and a number of more junior members, there was considerable agitation over the inadequacy of various appointments made by the Grand Master of individuals as provincial Grand Masters, and of the failure by many of these provincial Grand Masters to hold regular meetings with their provincial Grand Lodges. The contemporary Masonic press made great play of these failures, pointing out, for example, one extreme case, the twin provinces of Berkshire and Buckinghamshire, where only 4 meetings of provincial Grand Lodge had been held between 1847 and 1861. Eventually, Grand Lodge called for a report to be made from each province, detailing how many meetings of their provincial Grand Lodge had been held over the previous 10 years, and how often the provincial Grand Master had been present physically. It is of some amusement to realize the twin province of Berkshire and Buckinghamshire failed to make a return to this request. The reason given was that nobody could find the provincial minute book. It was at the same time, however, that the need for Grand Lodge to use provinces more effectively was emphasized by a general failure to fund adequately the main Masonic education charities. It was felt that Freemasons outside London were not playing a full and proper part in keeping the schools going. So the charities set up a committee to report on this underfunding. And there was a recommendation from that committee that each province should establish a committee composed of a representative from each lodge in that province, with its provincial Grand Master acting as president. We cannot doubt that if committees formed in the mode we recommend were established in each province, the disparity in the numbers of provincial and London subscribers, and the small proportion of high-placed brethren who appear in the lists would soon be materially modified. It urged that provincial brethren of good social position and holding high Masonic honors should become under pressure to become individual subscribers. In this way, it was expected that the system would create a regular channel of funds. And this was, of course, to become the basis of the present system of provincial festivals. I spoke of the way in which it was a fairly obvious step to link the creation of Masonic provinces to an existing county structure. But where such a structure did not exist, considerable difficulties arose. I looked first at the British Isles, at both Scotland and Ireland, where there has been considerable fluidity about the various geographical areas entrusted to various officers who were given the title of Provincial Grand Master. Scottish Freemasonry is dominated by there being many lodges founded long before the emergence of Scottish Grand Lodge. Many of them had originally refused to accept the authority of such a Grand Lodge. Out of 100 lodges active in the early 18th century, only 11 bothered to turn up for the initial founding meeting of Scottish Grand Lodge in Edinburgh in 1736. Some lodges sent representatives to the meeting, took one look at the proposal which would have restricted their traditional sovereign independence, and ran away. Some struggled for decades against joining, and as recently as 1983, Mother Kilwinning Lodge agreed that the Master of Kilwinning would no longer become automatically the Provincial Grand Master of Ayrshire. Instead, Mother Kilwinning was given the right for all time come to nominate a brother to become a Bible bearer of the Grand Lodge of Scotland, and that there should be erected and concentrated the Province Grand Lodge of Kilwinning, with Mother Kilwinning having the sole right to nominate the Provincial Grand Master in that province of Kilwinning. In 1738, the Grand Lodge of Scotland declared that seeing the principles of the craft had been so rapidly propagated through every part of the kingdom, it was found necessary provincial Grand Masters over particular districts. And in 1739, the Grand Lodge of Scotland appointed a provincial Grand Master whose area of responsibility was stated to cover Argyll, Clydesdale, Ayr, Dumbarton, Renfrew, and Stirling. When a successor was appointed in 1768, his area of authority was defined as covering merely Lanark, Renfrew, Ayr, Dumbarton, and Argyll. In 1756, Scottish Grand Lodge defined more closely the duties expected of a provincial Grand Master. Upon the motion from the chair that in order to have the affairs of Grand Lodge put upon a better footing, it would be proper and necessary that provincial Grand Masters should be appointed to visit the several distant lodges, examine their books, and report. And one such provincial master was informed his powers included holding general meetings and taking cognizance of everything relating to Freemasonry within the bounds of the district. There are two important aspects of the Scottish system. The minutes of Scottish Grand Lodge to this day show a significant fluidity about the boundaries of the various provinces, and the process of appointment is different from in England. In Scotland, provincial Grand Masters are elected by the masters and wardens of the lodges within the province. Once elected, they are recommended for confirmation by the Grand Lodge. And although they are nominally subject to re-election each year, they are usually in office for a 5-year period. In Ireland, originally, lodges were largely independent, working in accordance with their own ideas. Local committees were often established between lodges in order to achieve some regularity and uniformity in their observance of laws and regulations. But a report by Irish Grand Lodge, dated February 1829, indicated the opinion that the Grand Master should appoint provincial Grand Masters and authorize provincial Grand Lodges on the recommendation of the Grand Lodge of Ireland in such counties or districts as from the state of the order therein the Grand Lodge may think it of advantage to advise. And a further report laid down in 16 detailed paragraphs the responsibilities of provincial Grand Masters, of provincial Grand Wardens, and of provincial Grand Lodges. This was not to be the end of the matter. placing the responsibility for recommending the appointment of provincial Grand Masters and for defining the territorial areas for which they were responsible in the hands of Grand Lodge itself and not the Grand Master, meant for the next 20 years, Irish Grand Lodge minutes contain very detailed arguments for and against particular appointments as a provincial Grand Master, as well as many petitions for and against changing the areas over which particular individuals should preside, as well as for the moving of individual lodges from one province to another. It was not until the 1860s, after 4 years of consideration, debate, and a series of reports, that the present structure of 13 provinces plus a metropolitan area was finally accepted. Outside the British Isles, there are 2 European Grand Lodges with a provincial structure: the regular Grand Lodge of Italy and the Grand Lodge of France. When the regular Grand Lodge of Italy was founded in 1993, it adopted the constitutions of United Grand Lodge of England in full, except for very small changes due to the difference in numbers. There's also in Italy the Grand Orient of Italy, for which the United Grand Lodge of England withdrew its recognition in 1993 after the problems of the P2 Lodge, etc. There, the Grand Master is elected not by the Grand Officers in charge and past, and by the worshipful masters, but by all the brothers with a degree of master. There's no provincial Grand Lodge, but a council of venerable masters, which elects a president. In France, there are many Grand Lodges, some very small, and the general organization of these Masonic bodies may vary considerably from one to another. But there are certain general governing principles that seem to be commonly observed among non-recognized Grand Lodge. Looking at the Grand Lodge de France, one can see that it is much more centralized than the organization of the United Grand Lodge of England. Each lodge elects every year its representative to the Grand Lodge, which meets twice a year in Paris, under the name of Grand Lodge on St. John's Day in the winter, dedicated to Masonic affairs, or Convention of St. John in the summer, dedicated to administration and elections. France as a whole is divided into 6 or 7 regions, not provinces, and each region into sector, 33 in all for France. Before the formal meetings of Grand Lodge and Convention, the representatives of the lodges of each region meet in a congress, which has only informative power. There, the future votes are discussed, and a federal councillor for each sector is pre-elected before the convention, which confirms the election of each federal councillor. The 33 federal councillors compose the Federal Council, which has full executive power under the presidency of the Grand Maître. The convention then elects among the 33 federal councils the Grand Maître, 2 deputy Grand Maîtres, whose mission is only to substitute for the Grand Maître in his numerous representative tasks, and several executive officers, such as secretary and treasurer. The Grand Maître also nominates each year 1 assistant Grand Maître per region, whose mission is restricted to coordinating the federal councillors in their respective missions throughout that region. I make mention of one other area of interest, United States of America. With there being in the United States 51 mainstream Grand Lodges and some 40 Prince Hall Grand Lodges, it's hard to give a single definitive answer. Many, probably most mainstream Grand Lodges have subdivided their states into districts where there is a district deputy Grand Master and usually no other district officers. Typically, the district deputy Grand Master will visit each lodge in his district once a year on behalf of the Grand Master. In theory, he will hear and settle disputes before they move up to Grand Lodge level. As an example, Virginia has over 300 lodges and 57 district deputy Grand Master, and the size of the district. Other Grand Lodges, such as Maryland, there are no district deputy Grand Masters, but there are Grand Inspectors, each in charge of between 2 and 6 lodges. They make 4 formal visits a year, and 2 of them take up the Grand Masonic words. They review the annual audits of their lodges and in theory serve as an early warning system for lodge problems. I'm aware that I have only skimmed the surface of my topic. There is clearly much more to be said on how the province operates and how far Grand Lodge is still dependent on there being an active level of cooperation between Great Queen Street and the individual lodges outside London. There is, for example, a certain degree of current disquiet that Great Queen Street is seeking to intervene much more proactively in areas of Masonic administration which fall under the purview of the province rather than Grand Lodge directly. For example, there has been great change in the groups from chosen, reflecting deep-rooted changes in the social and economic basis of local leadership. A couple of quotations from recent pronouncements in Grand Lodge are of considerable interest in this connection. I quote, "Some years ago, provincial Grand Masters suggested that the rulers got even more involved in the appointment of their successors. This rather surprised us, as we felt it could be seen as unwelcome interference. However, we were encouraged to think about the qualities that a good ruler in the craft might possess and how this might manifest in the success of their province. As a result, the whole system is now more robust and we are seeing the benefits. This is not in any way meant to denigrate those who have gone before, far from it. But with decisions being more transparent, I believe the burden of decisions the sharing of the burden of decisions has been welcomed and the craft is benefiting as a result." Or again, "Believe it or not, brethren, in addition to selecting those who we think will do the best job and are the best fit, we now actually tell our provincial and district Grand Masters what is required of them. About 3 times a year, we run courses for future and new provincial and district Grand Masters. And the feedback that I have had from those who have attended has been extremely positive." In September 2019, the Grand Secretary said at a quarterly communication, Union of Grand Lodge of England has traditionally been a federal amalgamation of city-states, each ruled by a provincial or district Grand Master, whose patents were granted by the most worshipful Grand Master. It was not uncommon in decades past for those chosen few to be given their patent and told, "Get on with it," but with very little instruction or guidance as to what the "it" entailed. We like to think that we are more enlightened now and take some time and effort to explain what we think a provincial or district ruler might want to consider. It would not be difficult to find instances in the affairs of the province and the playing down of the initiatives that could be taken by provincial Grand Masters. There is a comparison. We might make comparisons with the way over the last century, central government in England has been able to intervene much more actively in the details of local administration at county and borough level. I hope I have said enough to show how vital a part has been played by the province in development of Freemasonry, especially in England. When we examine, for example, the growth of Freemasonry during the last quarter of the 19th century, or during the years after the First World War, it is clear that that would not have been possible without the activities fostered at a provincial level. It is important, I feel, that those activities, that autonomy, be continued. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aubrey. That was a fascinating overview and introduction to an important aspect of the constitutional history of Freemasonry. I particularly found interesting the way in which you gave us an impression of the different structures adopted in other countries beyond England, which I found very instructive and useful. We've got a couple of good questions in the chat box, which I'll turn to in a minute. I would encourage anybody else who would like to ask questions to either raise hand or indicate in the chat box that they have a question, and we'll move on to those. But let me take the chairman's privilege first and ask Aubrey a question I've been wondering about myself during the lecture. You've emphasised the importance of provinces in English Freemasonry, but why did a structure for London not emerge? Particularly if we take that quote about Freemasonry in England being an amalgamation of a federation of city-states, what's been the implications of the fact that there wasn't a comparable provincial structure, a metropolitan Grand Lodge for London until quite recently? How important and what impact has that had on our understanding of the constitution of Freemasonry?
I think you put your finger upon a most important point, that London was deliberately different from the rest. London, I think, felt that it was different, and it didn't feel the same pressures as the provinces did. And this comes out sometimes to the disadvantage of London and sometimes to its great advantage. For example, at a time in the 19th century, when grand rank was being given in Grand Lodge itself, but also grand rank was appearing in the provinces, and you have the growth of that particular autonomy past provincial grand rank, so the honours were being distributed left, right and centre. London Masons weren't able to get such honours because there was nothing between the honours of their own lodge itself and Grand Lodge itself. And it wasn't until they invented London Grand Rank and Senior London Grand Rank that you had certain amount of equity between the metropolitan area and the provinces. And of course, that had one great advantage. You hear often enough in the provinces arguments that so-and-so has been given a superior past grand rank than I've been given. It's all a matter of pride and of showing off, etc. And I've often felt it would be so much easier just to have had the London system of provincial grand rank and senior provincial grand rank without designating it. However, I'm nowhere near high enough in the hierarchy to be able to make such comments. But certainly, the distinction between the metropolitan area and all the rest has been, in a sense, to say London is rather more important than the to representing a more detailed topic, and I would welcome such a person coming forward.
Good. So the first question that's come up in the chat box is from John Belton. If we unmute John, I think he can ask it viva voce. So I could hand the floor over to John to ask his question.
Right. Thank you for that fascinating talk, Aubrey. I suppose for me, it was after 1813 that the establishment really took control over Grand Lodge. And the Duke of Sussex was elected, and he said, I shall appoint everyone else. And that's sort of the way it stayed ever since, including provincial Grand Masters. So I just wonder, has the system really served us well? We're not the army or the navy, but we're a voluntary organisation. And actually, we don't have a vote. We don't have any input. We don't have a say at all in what is really a very centralised bureaucracy. So I just wonder, after 70 years of decline, is it not time for a bit of change?
It'd be a very interesting question when there's a need to choose a new Grand Master. We've been very fortunate, and I'd say this in all sincerity, we have had a Grand Master who has been really committed to his work and who has served the craft very well indeed. But I just wonder what is going to happen, who is going to succeed him, who is going to choose the person who succeeds him. Is it going to be the board of general purposes? Is it going to be a small clique of the rulers, or is it going to be the provincial of any say? I suspect that what we will have is a statement that so-and-so has been nominated by the board general purposes to be our Grand Master, full stop. There is no answer. I mean, to be honest, although we're all supposed to be equal in lodge, to quote a famous writer, some are more equal than others, and I suspect that there will be no vote, and that it will just be a consensus cobbled together by somebody, and that we will be asked to accept it. And I think we probably will accept it, but that's another matter.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Aubrey.
Thanks, John. So the second question is our friend from Norway, Helge born Horisland. Do you want to unmute Helge as well? And he could ask his question. I've got it in chat as well if we can't do that.
Yes, good evening from Norway. Dear brother Aubrey, while the most successful Masonic movement in Europe during the 18th century, the Stricte Observance, actively marketed new lodges and provincial grand lodges all over Europe, it seems to me that Grand Lodge of England had a more laid-back attitude towards expanding outside England. Why this defensive attitude?
I think, firstly, there are problems of communication. That in London, it was difficult to know what's happening in the roads of provinces of England, let alone what's happening elsewhere. And I think it's just a matter, if somebody is good enough to want to sign up with London and to put itself theoretically under its jurisdiction, so much the better. It won't upset us very much. We won't have many problems associated with it. I mean, I think it's just a matter of the prestige, and it's nice to think that we have got so many quote subordinate, unquote, grand lodges or districts associated with us. I don't know if I can go any more than that. I don't know if that gives you an answer to your question.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll now go from Norway to Essex, and Gerald Riley has a question.
Sir, lovely to see you and hear you. Might it be the case that recent and future appointments of provincial Grand Masters reflect their managerial and admin skills rather than their leadership qualities?
Well, of course, one could argue that leadership qualities are dependent on having administrative skills, etc., themselves as well. But there has been a remarkable change. If you look at the people appointed as provincial Grand Masters over the last 100 years, it's amazing how far they reflect the changing social and economic aspects of their area. I mean, for example, I've done a study, as you might imagine, of the provincial Grand Masters of Leicestershire and Rutland. which start off amongst the nobility, go down into the leading professional classes. And more recently, we have had very, very successful businessmen who have been appointed as provincial Grand Masters and done very, very well indeed. It is a matter, I think, that the people who are interested in doing the work and come forward to do it, but they're coming from entirely different social groups. And we find in other provinces, there's a certain amount of weakness in the province, largely because the people coming forward are not the, quote, natural leaders, unquote. Whether they are the social leaders or the economic or business leaders. I mean, I was greatly struck, for example, by looking at a simple point, the relations between deputy provincial Grand Masters and provincial Grand Masters. The point was made to me, and I checked on it, and yes, I was right, that since 1856 in Leicestershire, there have only been 2 occasions when the new provincial Grand Master had not previously served as deputy provincial Grand Master.
Oh, right.
Now, I've done a partial survey of other provinces to see whether the same is true there. And despite the difficulty of there not being anywhere a complete list of deputy provincial Grand Masters for all the provinces, which I would dearly love to see, it is very rare indeed for the deputy provincial Grand Master to come on board as the Grand Master, as the provincial Grand Master. Even though in the past everybody said the provincial Grand Master was the figurehead and the deputy did all the work, when that figurehead retired, it was another figurehead they put in and not the deputy who knew all about it. But no, you're quite right that the whole area of the choice of provincial Grand Masters is one that needs to be looked at very, very carefully indeed. And I suppose that's why the Grand Secretary says that we have to educate them and tell them what to do. The old ones that knew what to do. Does that answer your question?
Excellently, sir. Thank you very much.
So we've got another question in chat, which I'll read out from Hashu Joshi, which actually kind of revisits some of the area you covered in your Prestonian lecture, Aubrey. So the first provincial Grand Masters were mostly nobility or landed gentry who probably had little or no interest in Freemasonry. Was there not a case, says Hashu, where the Duke was visiting the north and wished to meet the provincial Grand Masters? It turned out that one of those he wished to meet with his officers suddenly realised that the provincial Grand Master had not actually appointed any officers, so the appointments were done very quickly in a side room. Hasu Joshi wonders whether this is a true story or not. I know you had some very hair-raising stories in your Prestonian lectures of delinquent PGMs in the earlier part of the 19th century.
I must confess that it was indeed the provincial Grand Master of my own province at the time, who not only had not appointed any officers provincial Grand Lodge, but who very rarely had bothered turning up in the province to meet any of the individual lodges themselves. But it was a setup, I think, that what happened was that a number of the Leicestershire Masons who were friendly with Duke of Sussex prevailed upon him to visit Nottingham, which is just around the corner. And when he visited Nottingham, he invited all the provincial Grand Masters to meet him, and they all came. And then he said pointedly to the provincial Grand Master of Leicester, "Where are your? I'd like to meet your officers. Where are they?" And of course, he didn't have any. And as you quite rightly say, yes, he went round to those he brought with him from one of the lodges, and on the spot appointed them to provincial office, etc. But there's a long story of clashes between that particular provincial Grand Master and the leading Masons of his province. But no, it's not a made-up story. It is absolutely genuine. And there are occasions also where they appoint somebody. There's one case in Cumberland where the Grand Master wanted to appoint a particular individual as provincial Grand Master, but he couldn't because he was only an entered apprentice. He hadn't gone through the two further steps to qualify him, and therefore it had to be put off. And on yet another occasion in Kent, where an installation of a provincial Grand Master had to be delayed because although he was a Master Mason, he was not a past Master of the Lodge. And so the ceremony had to be adjourned and the individual had to be hurriedly put into the chair, and then he could be brought back and the ceremony of installation of PGM could continue. The whole area of relation between provincial Grand Master and Grand Masters and the Grand Master himself in this period is very, very hazy. It's all based upon friendship and who knows who and who is the leading individual within the county. They may not have had a great interest in the county, in the Freemasonry in the county, but they were the leaders in the county itself, the leaders of society. And it was at that stage necessary for respectability, etc., for the leading individuals in the county to be seen also as the leading Freemasons.
Yes, and there was that wonderful case in South Wales when the Ironmaster, they wanted to appoint the Ironmaster John Guest as a provincial Grand Master, and went some way down the line, then found he wasn't a Freemason at all. There was much consternation. But so thank you very much, Aubrey, for as I say, a wonderful overview of a key aspect of the constitutional history of Freemasonry. Those are all the questions that we've been posed, and I think you've shown us that how in order to understand the way in which the history of Freemasonry develops, just as it's important for us if we're studying wider history to understand political and cultural institutions like Parliament, like the monarchy. So if we're looking at the history of Freemasonry, we also need to think about offices like Grand Master, Provincial Grand Master, Provincial Grand Lodges, and how all that fits together and how that feeds into the structure of Freemasonry. And you've given us a wonderful illustration of how all that works. So
can I add a word, Andrew, please? I'm grateful for the offer to lecture this evening. I've enjoyed myself. If anybody wishes to put any further question to me, if they care to email me, I will be delighted to try to put together an answer. I don't guarantee I'll find the answer, but I'll find an answer that I think is relevant. So if you care to email me, my email address is new@le.ac.uk. So I'll be delighted to respond to you. But thank you very much for having come this evening.
Well, and thank you, Aubrey, for an enthralling talk. And I'd ask you to react by pressing the clap hand button in your on your Zoom panel. And thank you all very much. And we look forward to welcoming you again to future open lectures on Freemasonry.